Definitely.
We're very pleased to welcome a whole room full of students, faculty, neighbors to the first in a series of lectures by Professor Elizabeth Borgwardt. I'm not going to introduce Liz Borgwardt because those honors go to Professor Jim Sparrow from the History Department. I just wanted to make sure that everyone in the room knew that there were 2 more lectures in this series on May 1st in the same place, Constitutionalizing Human Rights, and then on May 15th in the law school at 3:30 in the afternoon. So they're all Tuesdays, but you have to keep track of the time. The next lecture, May 1st, will be here at 7 o'clock. And then the one after is May 15th at the law school at 3:30 in the afternoon. I also want to let people know, if you haven't seen the publicity, that Juan Mendez, who's the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the prohibition against torture, cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, and really sort of, as Professor Borgwardt was saying, Mr. Human Rights. He is the United Nations Special Rapporteur. He has been a commissioner on the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights. He's been an academic. He's been president of the International Center for Transitional Justice. He was himself a political prisoner under torture in Argentina in the 1970s. He will be speaking on Tuesday, April 24th at 7 p.m. or 6:30 p.m. at iHouse. And you can just look on the university website for more details. It's with great pleasure I introduce one of the faithful members of the Board of Directors of the Human Rights Program and a professor who teaches one of our core courses, Human Rights 2, History of Human Rights, Jim Sparrow.
It's my distinct privilege to introduce Elizabeth Borgwardt, our Richard and Ann Pozen Visiting Professor in Human Rights this year. Today, Liz will be presenting her first lecture from a 3-part series that Susan just mentioned, sponsored by the Human Rights Program, titled Human Rights Ideas and Institutions. To begin my introduction, I should start with the credentials, although I will have to say it's going to have to be an abbreviated version because her honors and her distinctions are many, and their description could easily fill up the time that we have remaining. Liz is an associate professor of history and law at Washington University in St. Louis, where she co-directs the undergraduate legal studies program and directs a new minor that she introduced in international relations. She's also a permanent faculty affiliate of the Center for American Studies at the University of Heidelberg, where she held a professorship in 2008. She came for a Fulbright, but they liked her so much that they decided to make the relationship permanent. Liz was also a fellow at the Center for Advanced Studies in Behavioral Sciences last year. In earlier years, she's also been a visiting scholar at the Charles Warren Center for Studies in American History at Harvard, a distinguished lecturer for the Organization of American Historians, and a Samuel Gottlieb Fellow in Legal History at the NYU School of Law. Each of those, I should point out, is an accolade accorded only to cutting-edge scholars. Like I said, that's just the short version, and I'm afraid I have to cut out everything from her secret life as a lawyer, the law degree at Harvard, the clerkship on the Ninth Circuit, the textbook co-authored on negotiating in international law and relations. I could go on, but I can't because we haven't even gotten to the book. Which brings me to her path-breaking book, A New Deal for the World, America's Vision for Human Rights, which was published by Harvard University Press in 2005. This work made a big splash when it appeared, reorienting more than one field in the process. And the influence of this book is reflected in the prizes that it quickly accumulated. As early as 2006, A New Deal for the World had been nominated for the Pulitzer Prize and had received 3 major awards: the Merle Curti Award for the best book in the history of ideas, presented by the Organization of American Historians, the Stuart L. Bernath Book Award for the best first book in the history of U.S. foreign relations from the Society of Historians of American Foreign Relations, and the Phi Alpha Theta Best First Book on Any Historical Topic. Phi Alpha Theta is the History Honor Society. That's a range of awards that one doesn't ordinarily see in a book. These are extraordinarily prestigious awards, and they're well-deserved. The book really is that big, and we here at Chicago certainly appreciate the virtues of the big book, in capital letters. Its intellectual range and chronological scope runs from Machiavelli, Grotius, and Kant to Wilson, Roosevelt, both Franklin and Eleanor, Justice Robert Jackson, and Nelson Mandela. At its heart is the story of the Atlantic Charter, and the extraordinary constellations of international institutions that respond by its vision. Not only the United Nations with its San Francisco Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but also the Nuremberg Charter and Tribunal, and the International Monetary Fund, as well as the World Bank. I should add that although the book's subtitle and its popular reception both underscore the importance of the book's argument for the history of human rights, it is just as profoundly an account of the origins of the most important multilateral institutions in the post-war global order. While A New Deal for the World offers plenty of fresh insight for the historian of high politics and of ideas to feast upon, it is also impossibly grounded in social and cultural history at the grassroots level. And this, I say with extreme understatement, is an incredibly difficult thing to do as an historian, simply at the level of methodology. Well, as you can see, I'm something of a fan of A New Deal for the World. Perhaps the more appropriate term would be a groupie at this point. I assign the book rather too frequently, as some of my students know, but I have yet to tire of it after many rereadings. And for those of you who have taught in the classroom, you know that this is one of the sincerest accolades you can give to a book. You simply can't inflict anything on yourself or on the students more than once or twice unless it's really very good. Life is just too short. Which reminds me, Liz has been very patient, and so have you. So please join me in welcoming her for her talk, The Transformation of the Modern International Human Rights Regime.
So, wow, that's what happens when somebody asks for your whole CV, right? Maybe you shouldn't actually send it to them. But thank you very much, Jim, for that incredibly fulsome introduction. I mean, I have houseplants, I think, that have been nominated for a Pulitzer, so I should probably take that. It's just nominated, right? So I should probably take that one out. But anyway, I appreciate it very much. And thanks to your colleagues in history and law for being so very welcoming for my already seemingly too short time on campus. Special thanks also to the faculty and staff of the Human Rights Program, particularly Michael Geyer, who's here for a flying visit, Susan Zesch, and Sarah Moberg. Finally, thanks to all of you for coming out tonight. I feel honored to be able to be teaching a seminar here and to be sharing my work with you this evening. So this presentation is called Transformation of the Modern International Human Rights Regime. I think it is overclaiming somewhat. I should call it maybe the wartime transformation of the modern human rights regime. But when I was asked about public lectures, I thought I would give one on each of my book projects. So this is on the first one, and then next week will be on, I have a book in progress on crimes against humanity, and then the one at the law school is on a new project that I have on corporate accountability for human rights violations. And so the presentation is more about exploring the idea of how an ideological reconfiguration works in international politics, in the specific historical context of the human rights politics of the 1940s. So I talk a little bit at the end about laying the groundwork for a post-war international order, but the focus is on the World War II era. And I begin with a particular document, the 1941 Atlantic Charter, in the tradition of, for example, the diplomatic historian Felix Gilbert's iconic classic To the Farewell Address, where he takes a particular document, in his case, Washington's Farewell Address, and uses it as a kind of platform or jumping off point for a meditation and analysis of the roots of early American foreign policy. So it's in that tradition, as well as tracing the provenance of the particular ideas articulated in that text. The Atlantic Charter is a short statement of war and peace aims, and when I say short, I really mean it. It's fewer than 400 words, which is approximately the length of, say, an op-ed modernly in a newspaper today. It was negotiated bilaterally between Britain and the United States, specifically by US President Franklin Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and members of their senior diplomatic and military staffs. So this is a document that is so very thin in a kind of Geertzian sense, right? But it arguably becomes infused with content over time. And I want to use this talk to capture that dynamic, right? How does that actually work? So this was an extraordinary thing for FDR to be doing, right? In August of 1941, negotiating a statement of war and peace aims. Let me reconnect with my roots as a law professor and have a little Socratic moment. Why would that be such an extraordinary thing for FDR to be doing, given the date? Anybody? Anybody? Yes, Anna. Sorry? The U.S. is not in the war. U.S. is not yet in the war. Britain is, right? They've come through the Blitz. But it's months before Pearl Harbor, right? And so to be negotiating a statement of war and peace, right? What the world is going to look like after the war is over, war that you're not even yet in, okay, is really an extraordinary thing for FDR to be doing. And he's very mindful of isolationist constituencies back home. Jessica, I know you know the answer to that question, all right? Thanks for helping me out here. Anyway, worked out. Okay, so I'd like to start with a little vignette, all right, drawn from what my social theorist friends refer to as my archival fetish. August of 1941 finds FDR undertaking his longest public walk since having contracted polio almost exactly 20 years earlier. Okay, and he's walking down the long quarterdeck of the British battleship Prince of Wales. Okay, and he can't really walk, right? He has this tremendously powerful upper body. He's got braces on his legs. He can kind of swing his hips to simulate walking. He's got a cane in one hand, and his arm on, he is being held by the arm of his, one of his sons, Elliot, who's a naval officer. Okay, so his aides obviously thought this was a terrible idea, right? What if he falls? What if it's a long walk? What if he's not strong enough to, what if the deck pitches? They are very discouraging of this. And he is very alert to the symbolic value of taking this walk. He's walking to take a seat at the right hand of Winston Churchill for a joint British-American religious service on Sunday morning service that has been carefully stage managed by Winston Churchill, right, on the second morning of this 3.5-day shipboard conference for, as noted, FDR, Churchill, and members of their senior staff. And it's being held under conditions of the utmost secrecy off the coast of Newfoundland. Very colorful stories around Roosevelt leaves behind an impersonator sailing up and down the Cape Cod Canal with, you know, the cigarette holder and the dog and the whole. Eleanor doesn't even know where he is. So these two leaders hadn't met before, arguably, or certainly they hadn't met as leaders of their respective polities. There's some little dispute about maybe they met at a dinner party, kind of, in the World War I era when Roosevelt was Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Churchill, 8 years older, already in the British cabinet at that time, and apparently kind of gave Roosevelt the brush off. Roosevelt was, I think, 36 at the time. So they had a sort of tacit agreement that they were going to push the reset button, right, and treat this as their first meeting. And Churchill is, of course, undertaking the longer and more dangerous journey to get there across U-boat-infested waters of the North Atlantic. And so he's speculating. Actually, Harry Hopkins is with him. An FDR aide is with him. They're playing backgammon. And Churchill's speculating. He says, "No lover ever studied every whim of his mistress, as I studied those of President Roosevelt." Churchill always uses this kind of spooky gendered imagery for the United States, which is always female. U.S. always female. So one of the reasons that we know so much about this walk is that FDR is doing it in front of 1,500 British and American sailors who are arranged on this quarterdeck for the religious service, right? You know, in a kind of, and it's incredibly moving to them to see what this effort costs the president, right? And some of them are crying. They keep diaries, they write letters, and so that's part of why we know a lot about it. Churchill, as noted, had selected the hymns and readings to emphasizing themes of duty, loyalty, and unstinting support to those in need, right? Churchill wants the US to come into the war. The verse was drawn from Joshua, "As I was with Moses, so shall I be with thee. I will not fail thee nor forsake thee. Be strong and of good courage." FDR dictated in a journal entry that night that even if nothing else had happened at this conference, that religious service would have cemented his sense of alliance with Churchill. And it's comparatively unusual for, FDR, even to dictate a journal entry, right, is comparatively unusual behavior for FDR, not like a super reflective guy, right, for those of you who've studied him. And just that he did this shows his own sense of the historic import of this moment. So this meeting on board the Prince of Wales, HMS Prince of Wales, and the USS Augusta, right, they're going back and forth between these two ships, results in this 8-point joint declaration, right, the document I mentioned, and it's distributed as a telegrammed press release. And I'm not going to go through the points, but I'm just going to group them thematically into 3 categories. Okay, so the first category is a set of kind of rehashed Wilsonian ideals drawn directly from the World War I era, that the war is not being fought for any kind of territorial aggrandizement, right, and that any boundary changes that result from the conflict will be in accord with principles of self-determination, right? We even see the echo of the Wilsonian language. There's a second set of points advocating provisions of free trade and disarmament under the auspices of a collective security organization, right? That's the language that's used. It's deliberately vague, right? But this is the first, at least multilateral reference, right, bilateral reference, because it's just US and the United States, to what becomes the United Nations. Okay, so you see Roosevelt being very oblique, all right, because he doesn't want to further inflame isolationist opinion back home. The third group of points is promoting the development of the human personality, right, this great New Dealer language. Talking about improved labor standards, economic advancement, social security, and the most lyrical phrase, which I'll paraphrase, is that after the final destruction of Nazi tyranny, that we hope to see established a peace in which all nations may dwell in safety within their own borders, and which will afford assurance that all the men in all the lands may live out their lives in freedom from fear and want. So let me say something about FDR's objectives for the Atlantic Charter. Earlier in 1941, the president had expressed interest in some kind of public statement, this is a quote, of the objectives in international relations in which the government of the United States believed that would advance the cause of keeping alive some principles of international law, some principles of moral and human decency. This is very unusual language for FDR, who is, of course, himself a lawyer, but for him to explicitly talk about international law is uncharacteristic for him. A close aide of his and a trusted interpreter of public opinion named Hadley Cantrill had also been suggesting that the president develop a statement of war aims that would educate the American public regarding the likely effects of a Nazi victory and ideology. In other words, what would it really be like if the Nazis win and thoroughly take over Europe? And especially what he means by the 4 freedoms, what FDR means by the 4 freedoms. So let me back up and just spend a minute with the 4 freedoms. The previous January, in his annual message to Congress, which is now more popularly known as the State of the Union Address, FDR claimed that he sought to establish the 4 essential human freedoms everywhere in the world: freedom of speech and worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. Okay, so you see how the later Atlantic Charter language already echoes those cadences. This framing was explicitly international in FDR's hands, right, as he repeated percussively after listing each freedom, freedom of speech everywhere in the world, freedom of religion everywhere in the world, to the point where his advisors were sort of dubious about this international framing, right? And one of them said, you know, Mr. President, I really don't know how interested the American people are going to be in the 4 freedoms for the people of Java, to which FDR reportedly replied, well, they're going to have to be someday, Harry. This was to Harry Hopkins. So they might as well start now. And as we know, these 4 freedoms, well, as many of you know, right, soon come to be interpreted in an almost exclusively domestic context, right? Because what happens? Norman Rockwell paints the images of each freedom, right, originally for the Saturday Evening Post, and then the series of paintings gets picked up as the basis of a war bond campaign and made into posters, which would have been seen in every public school, every post office, almost every public building in the United States from 1943, late 42, 43 on. And so become some of the most iconic images of the war are this Norman Rockwell series called The 4 Freedoms, where Rockwell uses images of home and hearth, right, as the freedoms worth fighting for. As an interesting aside, Rockwell in his autobiography said he originally thought he might paint the Atlantic Charter, but then he said, it was so boring that I couldn't even read it. All right, so he ends up with the 4 freedoms. And it's so domestic to the point that I think the most iconic one, I can even call it to mind for many of you, of this you know, older lady, mother or grandmother, setting down a turkey, right, in front of her family, a very otherwise simple meal that they're having, and she's got this enormous roast turkey. Right, that was freedom from want. Okay, and so to the point where this image was actually offensive to starving and overrun European allies of the United States who really did not see themselves as fighting for the right of Americans to consume enormous roast turkeys. But again, you know, Rockwell's looking for something that he feels is going to have traction in a much more domestic context. So, but as we can see, right, both the 4 freedoms and the Atlantic Charter are framed in this kind of deliberately thin idiom, right, where they're aspirational, they're motivational, and accordingly, as the Rockwell example, I think, illustrates, they mean different things to different people, okay? So I want to use this central section of this presentation briefly to contrast 3 different constituencies, centering around the question of to whom should the Atlantic Charter apply, which was a very lively controversy in 1941 and 1942. So Roosevelt's speechwriter and the playwright Robert Sherwood said that it was not long before the people of India, Burma, Malaya, and Indonesia were beginning to ask if the Atlantic Charter extended to the Pacific and to Asia in general, which leads to an exasperated series of press conferences that FDR gives where he says, you know, we called it the Atlantic Charter because we were meeting in the Atlantic, right? And it applies to the whole world. Furthermore, the Charter's reference to individuals in its famous point 6, right, the one that I quoted, all the men and all the lands, this would have been an obvious place in an international instrument, even a vague and non-binding international instrument, to refer to sovereign states, right, as earlier drafts of the Charter in fact did. So this alternative language about all the men, i.e. referencing individuals, had an implicit corollary, okay? I mean, this is an argument that I'm making, right? But that individuals were now somehow an appropriate object of international concern. The specific issue of individuals was seized upon by a young black lawyer in South Africa named Nelson Mandela. Okay, so Nelson Mandela is so old, right, that he was already a lawyer in 1941, and he writes a passage, he has a passage in his memoirs that are published much later, but this is actually kind of a long quote, but I think it's worth it. Mandela writes, "The Atlantic Charter of 1941, signed by Roosevelt and Churchill, reaffirmed faith in the dignity of each human being." Okay, so there's our human rights link, right, that we're starting to see. Some in the West saw the Charter as empty promises, but not those of us in Africa. Inspired by the Atlantic Charter and the fight of the Allies against tyranny and oppression, the the African National Congress created its own charter. We hoped that the government and ordinary South Africans would see that the principles they were fighting for in Europe were the same ones we were advocating at home. Okay, well, it's a memoir, so it's not quite accurate, right? The ANC already had a charter. They just modified it, I think, to incorporate this Atlantic Charter language that they liked. But you can see how this idea, right, that individual citizens could have some kind of direct relationship to a supranational authority or a supranational legal order would have an obvious appeal, right, to subjects of oppressive regimes the world over, right, because it implies a sort of skipping over of that intervening level somehow of a sovereign nation state. So this is one interpretation, right, of the Atlantic Charter as an anti-colonial instrument. Unsurprisingly, Nelson Mandela's Atlantic Charter was not Winston Churchill's. Churchill noted rather testily in response to an Indian pamphleteer charging him with hypocrisy in the months after the Atlantic Charter was promulgated. I'm not going to do the voice, okay, at least not without, a couple of drinks. He says, at the Atlantic meeting, we had in mind primarily the restoration of the sovereignty, self-government, and national life of the states and nations of Europe, now under the Nazi yoke. So for Churchill, the Atlantic Charter is aimed at what were then known as the European governments in exile, right, kind of bucking them up. This controversy over to whom does the Atlantic Charter apply was actually the context in which Churchill stands up in Parliament and offers his very famous quote about, I did not become the king's first minister in order to preside over the liquidation of the British Empire. It's in the context of this controversy. So Churchill's charter is an inspirational polemic targeted at British morale and the morale of the invaded countries of Europe. And what I'm obviously very figuratively calling the Mandela's Charter is a much more radical conception of international law that had some place for the standing of individuals, unmediated or minimally mediated by the intervening layer of a sovereign nation state and applying on an equal basis worldwide. So FDR speechwriter Sherwood observed sardonically that once you state a moral principle, you are stuck with it, no matter how many fingers you may have crossed behind your back at the moment. So I have just some images to show you quickly, just 4 of them, some political cartoons from the time. So this is exactly from this controversy, right, about to whom does the Atlantic Charter apply, and Roosevelt saying everyone, right? He's stretching it around the world. Okay, so let's see the next one. Okay, I love this cartoon, okay? It's not just the high school quality of the art that I find so hilarious, but this is on the 2nd anniversary of the charters being signed. Okay, so it was a telegram, right? And it wasn't signed by actually it was signed by Roosevelt and then he signed Churchill's name. But, this idea that there's like a desk on board the HMS Prince of Wales, and that's the ghost of Lincoln, So it's sort of pulling all this iconography in to kind of legitimate this actually seemingly quite casual diplomatic press release in some ways. All right, let's see the next one. Okay, this one has a lot going on. This is from later, when after the United Nations Charter has been negotiated in 1945. Okay, this is from the what was traditionally called the isolationist newspaper, the Chicago Tribune. Okay, they call themselves nationalists. They wouldn't call themselves isolationists. But the World Charter is the United Nations Charter. That's their term for the United Nations Charter. Okay, so they don't like the United Nations Charter. All right, are you netting that from this image? So there's all this, and they're saying that it's part of what's wrong with it is it's imperialist, and it's also not responding to, victims of oppression that have already, it's hypocritical, right? So the World Charter is just going to lead to more wars. It's bristling with gunboats and black smoke. The dove of peace has nowhere to land. And what's down here? The Atlantic Charter, sad, right, with all of the examples of allied hypocrisy, okay? And my favorite part, which is this little flag that says idealism, with a fish looking at it. Okay, all right, it takes so long to explain it, but I think it's worth it. All right, and the next one is the last one. Okay, and so this is also from 1945, right? Published on July 4th, 1945, just the week after the United Nations Charter has been negotiated. And that's, again, using this iconography of kind of iconic documents in American political culture where there's a kind of lineage that is this cartoonist is trying to establish. They're from the Declaration of Independence, but the idea that these international charters, of which there are a number, right? There's the Bretton Woods Charter, as Professor Sparrow mentioned, the Nuremberg Charter, and by and large, similar or the same negotiation teams working on these different charters. A lot of them say that what are they doing with these charters? They're trying to operationalize the Atlantic Charter, okay? And that the Atlantic Charter has the same relationship to something like the Nuremberg Charter or the United Nations Charter as the Declaration of Independence has to the US Constitution, right? That's the relationship that interests them. Okay, that's all I have for images. So what about FDR's Atlantic Charter? His contribution was to emphasize an explicit infusion of aspirational economic rights. So we can get a feeling for what was new here by projecting ourselves back to the historical moment in 1941 when the realities of oncoming war, oncoming from FDR's perspective, right, obviously not from Churchill's, are colliding with the ideologies of the mature New Deal, right? And it gives us a new synthesis. Another section of FDR's Four Freedoms speech from January of '41 had spelled out the president's basic ideas about things expected by our people of their political and economic systems. Again, I'm just trying to indicate with my voice when I'm quoting. This list was elaborated upon by Charles Merriam of the National Resources Planning Board, a New Deal agency, right? Charles Merriam, University of Chicago, political science professor, back in the day when political scientists actually wrote things that people could understand, in a widely reprinted pamphlet called Your Economic Bill of Rights. Okay, so what are your economic Bill of Rights, right? Here's the list very quickly. It has 7 points. For everyone, equal access to minimal security, as well as to the adventures of civilization, right? This great New Deal language. For everyone, food, shelter, and clothing on an American minimum standard. For everyone in the world then, not clear. For everyone, a job at a fair wage if he is in the labor market, and a guarantee against joblessness. For everyone, a guarantee of protection against accident and disease. For everyone, a guaranteed education adapted to his personality and the world in which he lives. For everyone, a guarantee of protection against old age. Good news. And finally, for everyone, an opportunity for recreation and the cultural opportunities appropriate for his time. To his time. So this is an astonishing list. You know, I mean, I really think that one measure of the extent to which our contemporary sensibilities have been shaped by Cold War-inspired shifts in certainly the American discourse of rights is the continuing power of such a New Deal-inspired catalog to surprise us. Charles Merriam further explained in a widely reprinted 1941 lecture that democracies have 2 great objectives in what he termed world relationships: the security of a jural order, J-U-R-A-L, order of the world in which decisions are made on the basis of justice rather than violence. That's one prong. And the fullest development of the national resources of all nations and the fullest participation of all peoples in the gains of civilization. So linking these 2 ideas together was a New Deal-inspired contribution, I would argue. Just as the New Deal, again, painting with the very broadest brush, was about a reconfiguration of the notion of security for the individual citizen, right, social security. So the internationalized version of the Four Freedoms and the Atlantic Charter can be construed as an attempted projection of the New Deal approaches onto the wider world stage, reframing international security as having explicit social justice dimensions. Okay, and it's not unique to the United States because I think that these New Dealers are in a particularly strong transatlantic dialogue with the British, who are developing the Beveridge Plan at the same time, who themselves are referencing the New Deal. Okay, but I think the national security link is particularly new, and the Brits are not making it very much at this time. So the Atlantic Charter then becomes multilateralized in 1942, when it becomes a formal statement of war aims, and it's adhered to by the 26 nations then fighting in 42, the Axis, right? Immediately after the Pearl Harbor attack, December of 1941, thank you, Churchill proposes another bilateral summit to formalize Anglo-American military operations. He comes back to Washington for Christmas. He has a heart attack in the White House. It's kept very secret. He addresses a joint session of Congress. He's very eloquent. FDR is jealous of him. So there's a lot going on in the White House at this time. And in private conversation, Churchill indicated that he no longer saw himself as the hopeful suitor in his relations with the United States, commenting that now that she is in the harem, we talk to her quite differently. Another one, right, exactly. So FDR himself coins the term United Nations for this anti-Axis military alliance, right? He actually likes the way it de-emphasizes the military component and emphasizes common purpose. So we have this next document, the January 1942 Declaration by United Nations, right? So it's Christmas, then it's New Year's, 1942. This is the statement that the other allies sign on to, right? It's a little bit confusing to call it Declaration by United Nations, since we know we don't have a permanent United Nations organization until the end of the war. But anyway, this document begins by affirming the common program and purposes, the common program of purposes and principles known as the Atlantic Charter. All right, so that's what it's doing, is it's multilateralizing the Atlantic Charter. It's making it explicitly into a set of war aims. This UN coalition then goes on to assert that they're fighting in order to secure decent life, pledging to cooperate in order to preserve human rights and justice in their own lands as well as in other lands. Okay, so the term human rights had been absent from the December 25th draft of this UN declaration. It was likely added in response to a memo from presidential aide and veteran New Dealer Harry Hopkins, who wrote that another sentence should be added, including a restatement of our aims for human freedom, justice, security, not only for the people in our own land, but for all the people of the world. Hopkins continued, I think a good deal of care should be given to the exact words of this, and I do not think the reference to the Atlantic Charter is adequate. Okay, so it's exciting when you find somebody actually saying things that you sort of sense intuitively. All right, so now I want to, in this last part of I want to broaden this presentation analytically to argue that this 1942 UN declaration is the first multilateral statement of the 4 key elements of a transformed understanding, a transformed anti-Axis reading of the term human rights. Okay, and these 4 elements included, firstly, highlighting traditional political rights as core values, so the kinds of things that you would find in the US Bill of Rights, for example. Secondly, incorporating a broader vision of so-called 4 freedoms rights, which included specific references to economic justice. Thirdly, at least suggesting that the subjects of this vision included individuals, as well as the more traditional unit of sovereign nation states. And finally, fourth, emphasizing that these principles applied internationally as well as domestically, which is what contributed to this anti-colonial overlay that I mentioned earlier on. Okay, I would submit that this synthesis was something new under the sun in early 1940s international relations, and that all 4 elements continue to inform our post-war understanding of the term human rights, continuing into the present day. Human rights was obviously not a new term in the 1940s. All right, you find it in the Seneca Falls Declaration of 1848. It's a sort of variation of the much older term rights of man. But we can see an important transformation here under the impact of specific political events. So even a short digest of this argument, such as this one, would not be complete without saying something about the question of Allied hypocrisy, right? What about that ship that had all the littered tags around it? In January of 1942, leaders in Nazi Germany were meeting at the so-called Wannsee Conference, widely held to be the inauguration of what we've come to know as the final solution. Now historians date this decision earlier, but still that's a kind of landmark moment. It's the same month. At the very same time, January of 1942, US officials approved the Japanese Relocation Order, confining 135,000 US residents of Japanese descent, approximately a third of whom were US citizens, to internment camps. Okay, it's not executed in January of 42, but it's actually agreed upon then, issued then. Having all these events happen together only emphasizes why it is important continually to juxtapose discussions of words and ideas with an examination of lived realities. Reacting to the initial 1942 Declaration of United Nations, Mohandas Gandhi wrote to FDR in July of 42, "I venture to think that the Allied declaration that the Allies are making the world safe for democracy sounds hollow, so long as India, and for that matter Africa, are exploited by Great Britain and America has the Negro problem," his language, in her own home. Gandhi's letter underscores how aware historical actors themselves sometimes are of these yawning gaps between rhetoric and reality, right? This dissonance can itself constitute a kind of engine of historical change, right? In its own right, precisely in order to narrow the gap somewhat. Okay, this material distills a small section of a much larger book project, and for a much larger book, for those of you in Professor Sparrow's or Geyer's classes who were forced to read it, focusing on how specific institutions were devised during the war to give expression to the Atlantic Charter's war and peace aims. And I look at the negotiations around charters from 3 institutions, Bretton Woods, the United Nations, and the Nuremberg Charter. So the book posits this thesis that US post-war planning can be seen as a projection of the New Deal regulatory state into the international arena. And again, just as this reconfigured idea of security domestically for US citizens, these wartime planners were interested in reconfiguring the idea of security at the international level. And this book tackles these broad themes by using the prism of human rights ideas, that a key piece of this conceptual reconfiguration of national security and the very idea of the national interest was an integrated vision of human rights as including both economic and political rights. So these charters of the international institutions of the 1940s, notably Nuremberg, which is taken up somewhat in the next lecture in this series, but also the United Nations Charter and Bretton Woods charters were meant to sort of thicken international politics to the point where they could generate norms that would basically take us from morality to ethics, right? That in that duality that Avishai Margalit likes so much, which is drawn from Hegel. You know, from thin precepts to thicker rules. They're going to be processed through an institution. In the sense of injecting some kinds of perceptions of community standards and even a mild enforceability into the international realm. And I want to be careful not to overclaim yet more that not that an international community that is created that is somehow analogous to a more local community. The idea here is much more attenuated. Right? It's related to using transnational institutions to create what international lawyers call jus cogens, the idea that if you violate a particular kind of norm, you know you are doing wrong. All right, and this argument is a kind of bridge to my current project. I love that I'm telling Tom Ginsberg what jus cogens is, okay? It means if you, anyway, where I'm looking at the role of the Nuremberg trial in thickening the idea of crimes against humanity. So not that such norms aren't violated, right? They are all the time, okay? Or that there are even necessarily specific sanctions when they are violated. But in the post-war world, with genocide and slavery, arguably, you can't do them and not, and it's just not possible to say that you didn't know that you were doing wrong. So I will leave you with a quote from Churchill that I think unwittingly captures the power of the Atlantic Charter as a kind of human rights symbol. Okay, and it's, I say unwittingly because it comes from a conversation with FDR where Churchill is kind of trying to wiggle out from the perceived strictures such as what would they be, of the Atlantic Charter by arguing that it's not a contract and it's not legally binding, which is a hilarious conversation for a lawyer, right? Because I mean, of course it's not legally binding, right? Any more than you could take the Declaration of Independence into a court and say, like, enforce this, it's being violated, right? But arguably a document, you know, not without salience in American political culture. Anyway, so as part of this argument, Churchill says that the Atlantic Charter is not a law, it is a star, okay? But sometimes we are more bound by our stars than by our laws. Thank you very much. And I'm happy to take your questions. Okay, and I know some of you have to go, so like no sanctions. But if you have questions, I'm happy to try to respond. Professor Ginsberg.
So it's a question about the way this, the impact of the Atlantic Charter in the United States. I mean, there's a lot of work on how the UN Charter later becomes an instrument of social mobilization here. And you've talked about, you know, Gandhi and Mandela reading it and taking inspiration. Is there any sort of, do social movements pay attention to the Atlantic Charter, or is it already sort of, you know, the Four Freedoms has already taken up the political space within the United States? Do you have any domestic impact?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And I think that the answer is it sort of depends on which communities you're talking about, because the Atlantic Charter is very much taken up by the African American press, particularly leading journals in the Chicago area, because of that sort of W.B. Du Bois internationalist overlay. Right, that at the same time that, you know, the Nigerian Student Union is writing to Clement Attlee as Deputy Prime Minister and saying, does the Atlantic Charter apply to us? There's ferment and debate domestically in the US. But I think you're right about the Four Freedoms, you know, kind of taking up all the psychic space for those kinds of general aspirational moments in more, I don't know what you would say, sort of middle America, popular opinion. In the sense that, you know, look at Rockwell himself, right, as emblematic of that population, where he's saying, well, it's so boring, I couldn't even read it, and translating the international dimensions of the Four Freedoms, such as they were, into this home and hearth kind of images. So, you know, I don't think it had a lot of traction as a political statement domestically. Yes?
I really enjoyed this lecture, and I had kind of a related question. I've been reading the book.
Actually, do you mind telling your name and what you work on, just like briefly?
I'm Nicole Wright, and I'm a provost postdoctoral scholar in English literature, and I work on ethics and law at the end of the 18th century in the novel.
That's so cool.
And I was reading the book for fun on Cold War civil rights, and I wonder if you could say a little more about how you talked about how historical actors, you know, in letters like Gandhi, show their awareness of these implications. Is there a certain time lag between when these statements first appear and when they start to crop up, and how does that trickle down effect kind of work where we see it passing into letters and newspaper op-eds of people from these local civil rights?
Well, as I would expect with someone of your background, right, you've immediately put your finger on like the key question in all of intellectual history, right, which is sort of how do we know that these you know, developments in literature, other kinds of cultural political developments have an impact? How do we measure? You know, if it's Tom Paine's pamphlet Common Sense, then we know how many printings there were and how many people read it, and they read it aloud, and you know, we get a sense of readership. We know it had a lot of impact. Actually, the impetus for me writing this, I mean, this was my dissertation at Stanford. Part of the impetus was reading a book called Robert Devine's book Second Chance, about how, you know, after Pearl Harbor, Americans who had been isolationists woke up and realized that they should have been listening to Clark Eichelberger, who was an internationalist from the 1920s. And they were internationalists like after that. I mean, obviously that's a little bit over-schematized as an analysis of Devine's argument, but it just didn't seem plausible to me that, you know, when I went back and looked at what these internationalists were publishing in the 1920s, you know, Devine would say, oh, they had this pamphlet and it prefigures all these things, and it, you know, and 20 people read it, you know, and they printed 40 copies or something, and it just didn't seem like there would be that kind of penetration that you're talking about, you know. So I think there is a kind of trickle down dynamic, And it's very hard to measure. You know, I mean, I did something that I'm a little sheepish about now, but in terms of saying like, well, how do I measure even the term human rights? That if I'm making an argument that it's transformed at this particular historical moment. And so I looked in, you know, the index to the New York Times for just like when they would use the term. And there, you know, there's all the interwar references, of which there were only a handful, referred to kind of labor rights and specific civil, what was then called civil rights, not for racial equality, but, you know, Bill of Rights type disputes. And then it's really, you know, over the course of a 10-year period that includes the war, that you start to see a really big pop. And then, you know, post-war, there's just this huge explosion of the number of times the term is used. So it's hard to measure, but it links back to Professor Ginsburg's question in terms of like, well, how do we, if there's an impact, how do we know, you know? And are these people elite or are they not elite, and who are they? And how politically active are they? And those are very hard questions to answer, as I'm sure you know from your own work. Great question. Professor Geyer.
So what do you make of the argument that this is really a false dawn? Yes, the term was bandied around. It became indeed it came to be introduced into international diplomacy, which is certainly something, but it is not much more than that. It is really only 30 years later that human rights begin to matter. So that the thickening you're talking about is maybe a thickening, an institutional thickening, but it's not a thickening.
Or a thickening between the two sides of my skull, right? Yeah, well, you know, I would say to that, thank you, Professor Moyne. But anyway, I mean, I think that there's an argument about, I guess the way I would put it is, you've got Peter Holquist at Penn, who works on 19th century Russia, right? Okay, and he makes an argument that this terms like crimes against humanity and even human rights are a 19th century construct, okay, from, you know, international lawyers around the Tsar trying to get the Tsar to seem more cosmopolitan and more European. Okay, so he says these are where the genesis of the ideas. Okay, I'm making an argument about the 40s as transformative, where the ideas are getting plugged into institutions. Okay, and the institutions, you see the designers of these institutions using this kind of mechanistic language, right? That the institutions they're designing are going to like produce human rights, almost by just neutrally from their workings. Okay, and then I think Sam Moyne, who's actually a great guy and has been a wonderful mentor to me, okay, is making a different kind of argument about taking those 1940s developments and then plugging them into a social movement. And I agree with him completely that human rights do not become a social movement before the 1970s. But I think we're sort of arguing about different things in the sense that, you know, Sam is interested in periodization as he says periodization is a kind of argument, right? It's a kind of analysis. And so, you know, he has a chart in the back of his book where he looks at numbers of New York Times sites of human rights, and he says, okay, here's, you know, the 40s that goes from, you know, 0 to whatever, you know, and then here's the 70s. Okay, so why are we talking about anything before the 70s? Okay, and Mark Bradley of this faculty, who reviewed the Moyne book, said, well, fine, you know, if your chart continued, it would, and we looked at the 90s, it would be like, you know, it wouldn't even fit in a book. You'd need like a fold-out section. So why are we even talking about the 70s? Maybe we're really, you know, we really should be talking about the 90s. The idea that, you know, if I like ice cream, okay, the moment when I go from 0 ice cream cones to 15 ice cream cones is actually a really big moment for me. Right? And maybe it's a bigger moment than when I go from 30,000 ice cream cones to 50,000 ice cream cones, right? It's just a different kind of moment. And so I think a lot of the perceived differences of our scholarship are more along the lines of, you know, I just don't see the need to say that the 70s are unimportant if I say that the 40s are important, right? I think we can all kind of get along. And I think Peter Holquist is right too, right? In terms of these very elite international lawyers thinking about a lot of these concepts much earlier than we anticipated in a more European context.
Let me just add,
yeah.
one of the curious twists in this story is if you actually use Google Ngram.
Yeah, well, this came up before Google Ngram.
You will discover that human rights is a very popular term in Great Britain, but not in the United States. So it is actually very much a British term. But whose British term it is about as curious as in the 1780s and 1790s, in which human rights was very much a British term, to disappear later on.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for, I was hoping to have a venue to address, an avenue to address the, sort of competing interpretations. Yes, Dr. Walker.
So I'm very interested in your work on your upcoming talk on corporate social responsibility, and my work is trying to converge there too. And with CSR, I think we can connect here, which is I'm really interested to know your idea of this moment where we have it's not a contract. Human rights are not a contract. It's not legally binding, but these ideas are incredibly powerful. But I guess I'm sort of wondering what you think about Nuremberg, which becomes a moment because the Nuremberg trial.
Got a minute? Anyway, okay. Yeah.
Right. Where all of a sudden human rights is more than just an idea, it's something you can be prosecuted for if you don't obey them. So do you think that like with CSR, that there are sort of norms or there are ideas that there's responsibility, but there's no way to really, there are very few ways to actually prosecute corporations and criminal violations of human rights?
I'm going to repeat your question, okay, because you're right down front here. Do you mind? So, and I'm going to stop you because it's already so interesting that I can. So the question is that Dr. Walker works on corporate social responsibility, and she's interested in, how, looking at Nuremberg, that there's this transition point where you have these ideas, but suddenly this is something you can be prosecuted for, and that accountability becomes, I don't know, sort of operationalized. You didn't use that word, but that how do you talk about a norm like corporate social responsibility that you might not be able to be prosecuted for? What does it mean? Does it mean anything?
I'm just wondering what you think. Is Nuremberg a moment where human rights gains more traction because there is a threat that there are international courts of justice who can be prosecuted for violating human rights versus this is just an idea that we may or may not agree with. Gandhi has a different idea than FDR. We all just can invent our own interpretations of human rights. Do you think that Nuremberg is a moment where it gains traction, or do you not see it as important? Do you not see the prosecution moment or sort of the threat of liability moment as a major transition? I'm just sort of curious.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of, I don't see it as a threat of liability moment, okay? I was presenting some early material on Nuremberg, because my next book is more focused on Nuremberg, at Harvard, and as some of you know, Charles Mayer, very eminent professor of German and European history, where he listens to this presentation, he seems to be asleep through most of it, and then his eyes pop open, and he says, Nuremberg. I remember Nuremberg in real time. Everybody thought it was a joke, And like later I went and looked it up, and he was 8. He was 8 years old during Nuremberg. I'm sure he was a very precocious 8-year-old, all right? And that around the Meyer, household, they were talking about issues and, But anyway, so but I think it's actually, it's funny, but it's also a way of talking about change over time and kind of how long is a moment, when we talk about history. Because let me give a more focused example from the whole package of Nuremberg trials, right? There's a main trial, and then there's 12 so-called subsequent trials, and they're all over by 1949. Okay, so the subsequent trials are the ones that are focused on different themes, right? Doctor's trial, ministry's trial, judge's trial, right? So, and they're much smaller. Okay, so from the doctor's trial, we have in the judgment, we have what's called the Nuremberg Code. Okay, it's confusing. It's like Nuremberg this, Nuremberg that. The Nuremberg Code is the Nuremberg medical code about experimentation on human subjects. Okay, it's actually a list of points about informed consent that's just embedded in the opinion. Okay, and so it comes out at the trial. I mean, it's part of the decision, the judgment. Nobody really pays any attention to it. You know, what happens to it during the Cold War? I mean, it's in a book that's published, but we don't see until the 1970s the American Medical Association makes the Nuremberg Code part of their code of ethics. Is it a law? No, it isn't. You know, but in the 1980s, universities start to make the Nuremberg Code part of their code of ethics and their code that where you have to, I mean, many of you have been through this, right? You have to get approval to work with human subjects. That actually is the Nuremberg Code, that checklist. Okay, and then it becomes federal law. Obviously, all this is in a US context, in the 1990s. So it's a kind of case study in how a norm becomes a law over time, right? And it takes a really long time. And it's also a wonderful argument about the impact of culture on law, right? Because what's the difference that makes a difference in the mid-1970s that prompts the American Medical Association to do this? Can anyone guess? It's actually kind of a hard question, but it's Tuskegee. It's Tuskegee. Right? And so American doctors, you know, as a professional association, yeah, good, are saying, you know, what is it that makes us not Nazi-like? You know, because, ooh, we have these experiments, there's not consent, it's a little creepy. You know, what are we, you know, how are we going to, I mean, it's not so much launder our image, but like going forward, how are we going to make it better? Okay, I mean, that's the best face you can put on it. But sort of why the 70s and not some other time, you know, when it could have been underground forever, you know? But something pops up that's more of a, we want to call it a political development or a cultural development that suddenly reactivates ideas that are on some level on the shelf. Okay, so I think that's the dynamic, again, of a norm becoming thickening over time. That I'm interested in capturing. And it's sort of hard to talk about, as you can gather from this very long answer. So I'm sorry. Professor Sparrow.
So I wanted to get a multilateral aspect of your argument and ask, can we really call the IMF, the World Bank, and the Nuremberg Tribunal multilateral? I'd just be interested to hear you elaborate on that. I assume you're interested, and you know, from the book. And but I'd like to use that as a way to get at the question of how do you state more explicitly how multilateralism is tied to human rights?
Oh, that's a great question. And yes, I think they can be multilateral without being equal or fair. I mean, I think that the U.S. negotiators in this era being, you know, towards the end of the war, saw these institutions as a way of extending and entrenching U.S. power. Okay, so I think it's a kind of false duality to say, well, you know, why wasn't it altruistic? Or, you know, it's kind of like, well, whose interests would they be projecting other than their own, right? But my sense is this image is they reconfigured their sense of what the national interest was to include this process of multiplying the number of stakeholders. And this is part of what they thought they had learned from the World War I era, was you sort of minimize the number of players who have an incentive to kind of kick over the table, you know, because they're so unhappy with the status quo. The League of Nations system was so rigid that powers that were deeply unhappy with the status quo, like Japan, had no incentive to sort of work from within. Okay, so I think it was about, you know, this notion of almost creating stakeholders with sort of just enough of a sense that they did have a stake to make these organizations more flexible. But also, it's not to say that that was done successfully, right? I mean, the United Nations is a case in point. The design of the United Nations was completely failed to anticipate the two signal developments of the post-war era, namely decolonization and the onset of the much more virulent phase of the Cold War, right? And it wasn't designed to accommodate the role of those developments. Also, the human rights related provisions, there's a lot of internal contradictions just within the text of the UN Charter. But I think that in a sense, that document can answer the second part of your question about the role for human rights in multilateralism, because the first draft, or the first set of drafts of the UN Charter, right, coming out of Dumbarton Oaks, didn't reference human rights. And there was public outrage, right, including in the United States, saying, wait a minute, you know, we thought we were fighting for the Atlantic Charter. We thought we were fighting for human rights. Where is that stuff? You know, and there are all these religious organizations and, bless you, various kinds of protests related to saying, you know, there's just going to be another, and the link is with international security, right? That there's just going to be more wars unless part of the spreading around is, in addition to spreading around resources and decision-making authority, it's also spreading around human rights. Okay, so it's a dimension of human security that we need to be more explicit about, I guess. Okay, well, you know what? I know everyone's super busy, so thank you very much for being here at all. And I hope I'll see you in a few weeks.